Hello and welcome back to Human Fight Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down some more basic concepts and more basic techniques, and I'm going to be doing it on the backdrop of a ladies' night fight between Lacey and Amanda. Sorry, I don't really know last names here. But the reason I chose this fight is, one, we see a lot of really interesting adaptations, but a really, really common iteration of what I would generally call a beat attack. And there's a lot of confusion, I think, when people bring up the concept of a beat attack when it comes to HEMA, because on the one hand, there are a lot of Olympic fencing people who will say, oh, well, I know what a beat attack is. That's where you tap their sword out of the way and then you do some kind of attack. And then there's the HEMA section of the population that thinks all beat attacks are Zornhaus, and a concept where you attack into somebody else's blade. And I think in the reality is that beat attacks in the concept of HEMA lies somewhere in the middle of those two concepts. They're not so light and extremely positional based like they are in Olympic fencing, but on the other hand, they are not so brutish and targeted like they are maybe the way people talk about a Zornhau. So we're going to see some really good examples and some pretty nice adaptations. Now, for our first exchange and my first good example of what we're going to be talking about here, I want you to pay attention to the fighter on the right, and specifically what they like to do every single time they go to defend and simultaneously disguise their attacks. You'll notice this several times throughout this exchange. The fighter on the right, who I believe is Lacey, is going to move either forward or backward with her foot. She has her right foot forward. She's sitting in a kind of left plow. And she is either going to gesture up towards her left side with her sword as a kind of defensive action, or gesture out on her right side with her sword as a kind of offensive action. But in both of these cases, I don't believe that the intent here is either to attack or defend, but to simply telegraph to her opponent what she is thinking about doing and what kinds of responses she wants to get out of these kind of provocations. If you don't know, in Myers-Dussac, there is a concept that he likes to talk about called provoker, taker, hitter. And most of the time, I don't think this is a particularly useful way of breaking down a fight, as it's generally more complicated than that. But the provoker, the concept of using an attack or a defense that does not actually seek to accomplish any real goal, so much as it gets somebody else to either attack or defense, turning them into either the taker or the hitter at your command, is a really useful concept. And that is what I think is happening here. Every time we see Lacey go forward and we see her gesture with her hands, we see a similar kind of defense out of her opponent. And in that defense, we see openings and closings. We see areas where she is defending herself, and we see areas where she is not. And when you see the requisite parry repost exchange that comes at the end of all of this, we see how the information that was gathered during these provocations is important. Every time Lacey goes up onto her left side and kind of parries that area, what we know is that she is telling her opponent, hey, if you try to attack over here, I know exactly what I'm going to do and it's not going to work. And regardless of whether or not that's true, it might influence the decision-making of her opponent. Now, as we go into future exchanges, we're going to see a little bit more about how this information can be sort of downloaded and adapted to. But for right now, at the very least, what we see is a pretty clear exchange where someone is desperately trying to get a reaction out of their opponent, and maybe or maybe not, they're going to give it to you. So for our second exchange, we see another very similar setup that we saw to our first exchange, but with a completely different outcome. In this particular exchange, Lacey goes forward with a really big provoking attack that overextends a little bit and even hits the ground, at which point her opponent comes in, tries to get the response cut, but finds that Lacey is already out of measure, and she gets a really nice parry riposte. But the question is why did this work when such an obvious, or what you would think was an obvious overextension, didn't result in a response that was, adequately timed? And the answer, in my opinion, is that currently Lacey's opponent, Amanda, had been downloading all of these provocation attacks and been basically training herself to say, ignore them. And the idea here is that what Lacey has done is another provoking attack, one that I really don't think had the capability to land. It didn't really quite go far enough forward to make it even to where Amanda was standing at the beginning of the exchange, let alone where she moved to in her defensive action. But as a result, Lacey essentially tricked Amanda into moving out of range to do a parry for something that wasn't going to hit her, and then attempt to move back into range with an offensive action, only to find that she was actually too far out of range to do so. As a result, Lacey had more than enough time and opportunity to throw up a parry, even from a very compromised position, and get a nice parry riposte. So, if you're looking to do these kinds of provocation attacks, you have to do it in those two ways that we saw Lacey doing in the first section. You want to make sure that you are throwing your opponent information that is fake, and fake from the both directions of being a bad attack and a bad defense, so that they are essentially programming themselves to respond to something that isn't there. They are saying, hey, that defense is up, I'm not going to attack there. As a result, you can know pretty handily that they're probably not going to attack in that direction and come at you full bore. At the same time, if you're throwing these provocating attacks, they're going to think, okay, I have to be safe here. This is the defense I have to throw. As a result, they might overreact to something that actually wasn't an attack at all. So what we see in this next exchange is the very common counter to this concept of provoking hits. And I've talked about it before, but the general idea here is that if you go by the Meyer step process, any provoker can be turned into a taker or a hitter. And the idea here is to know which one you're going to be doing on the offset, but also if you know what your opponent is going to do, you can change up the game and put them in a headspace that they don't want to be in. In this particular instance, Lacey is throwing these tapping cuts all the time. She's constantly tapping the blade of her opponent, trying to get her to be desensitized to these kinds of actions so that she can try to follow them up later. However, Amanda does the counter, steps directly into what would normally be an attack, but this time is a provoking attack, throws a nice hard parry, and gets a really nice parry repost while stepping forward. The reason this can work is that normally stepping forward and parrying is a very risky thing to do because you have to make sure that in stepping forward, you're not walking into an attack. If you know that your opponent is throwing provoking attacks, then you know that they're probably not going to attack you really hard and really aggressively on this next one, and you can afford to take that stepping parry. At the same time, it solves the problem that we saw in the last exchange where by trying to take a defensive action against a provoking attack, you inadvertently set yourself out of distance and prevent yourself from throwing any good follow-ups. So, if you take that step forward, you get that good parry, you know you're going to be in the range, and you know you're going to be safe while you do it. However, there are even more adaptations to go down, and there's a lot more for the provoking side to be doing. For this next exchange, and I did skip one in the middle here, we see the adaptation from Lacey to this kind of tactic of somebody stepping forward into measure and basically riding on the fact that you're not going to throw something too aggressive on the uptick. And what has changed here is that Lacey is still doing the exact same taps. She is constantly tapping against the sword, she's constantly feinting into measure and then moving back out of it, and she's still trying to get that baited counterattack that worked so well in the second exchange. However, there is a little bit of a difference that happens here, and that is that all of this tapping that has been constantly happening throughout all three exchanges and the one that I skipped is finally going to pay off because now Lacey is finally going to take a step forward into measure, tap the blade, and for this time and this time only, Amanda does not take a step back or defensive action whatsoever. She has been successfully desensitized to these provoking actions that have been happening this entire time. As a result, rather than coming forward with a provocation, Lacey instead throws a very, very brief provocation that doesn't get the response that she really wanted, at which point she then goes from doing a provoking attack to a hitting attack. He's skipping the taker action altogether. And the idea here, if you follow the Meyer formula, is that by doing a proper provoker, you inadvertently turn your opponent into a taker when they didn't want to be a taker, they wanted to be a hitter. And as I said before, this starts to get really, really confusing and rather cyclical, but where this becomes very important is the idea here that if you remember, the reason that Amanda was able to be successful is that she successfully guessed when Lacey was going to come forward, but wasn't actually coming forward. And this time, she did not guess correctly. She guessed that Lacey was going to come forward and not come forward, and she was wrong. Rather than doing that stepping parry, which probably still would have resulted in the same exchange, she bit on a feint by just not doing anything at all and left herself open for a follow-up attack, thus proving that these provoking hits can be really easy to game around as long as you know all the steps that you have to go through. It could be that you are throwing a lot of provocation and you might be thinking, oh, this isn't working for me. My opponent has now realized that I'm not threatening. You can still be threatening with a provoking attack. You just have to change up your timing and you have to change up your distance and you have to make sure that the kinds of tells that you're looking for that represent openings for you change with your opponent. Now, for this last exchange, we see the final step of the mind game of the beat attack, or at least what I'm calling the beat attack here throughout this video. And the problem that we see here is one where we're trying to use the defensive provocation, and we're kind of seeing that it doesn't quite have the exact same kind of oomph as the offensive provocation. In my opinion, the defensive provocation, the constantly shifting up into a guard to basically telegraph to your opponent that you're safe there, does result in the intended effect of getting Amanda to come forward with a very large step and a very committed attack to somewhere that isn't there, And in that sense, it was successful. However, the follow-up that Lacey attempted to execute was one in which she completely voided that stepping attack and then got a little bit of a follow-up attack of her own, which doesn't seem like it worked out quite well. And the reason I think it didn't work out quite well is that when you're constantly telegraphing a defense to your opponent, chances are you're going to telegraph a really easy one, aka the one on your outside line, or the one that's just opposite your hands. Since she's in a left plow, that side protecting her left side is the easiest one to telegraph. It's the easiest one to get into. As a result, what you're essentially telling your opponent to do is something wacky, something weird, and something wild. And while this might seem like a win, because oftentimes the counter to someone doing something wacky and wild is to just go in straight over the top with something traditional, it does result in a lot of doubles. And in my opinion, it's actually probably a lot smarter to telegraph a defense that is maybe more unusual. For example, telegraphing a defense on your outside line on your dominant side hand, which is a really, really common hand shot that people love to throw. One that you can easily telegraph as being, showing, you just keep putting your arm out there and saying, hey, I'm defending my hand. You really shouldn't come out here. And at the same time, leaving them open for the most dominant cut, the most common cut for them to throw. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to give away your best defensive option for something like a throwaway feint or a throwaway provocation, when there are probably way more wacky things that you actually don't want to have happen to you. So as a result, in my opinion, a little bit of a mistake on Lacey's part. She is constantly telegraphing this defense. It finally pays off for her. She gets the attack that she was theoretically baiting this entire time, only to find that her counterattack wasn't really able to do what it was meant to do, because any kind of counterattack that you're going to throw against someone who comes in across the middle toward your hands is probably going to hit your hands anyway, and resulting in a kind of double. So, not maybe the result that she wanted, but still a really good demonstration of what you can do with defensive baits, defensive provocations, where you're basically trying to get your opponent to throw something that you want them to throw, just hopefully in such a way that you have a really, really strong defense already pre-planned for when it actually happens. So that's going to be it for today. Probably a really short one, but if you'd like to see more commentaries like this, I'm going to be making another video on Thursday.